Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see so many of you here. I know it's a little chilly out there, but I'm glad you all came on this chilly evening. On behalf of the Sol Price School of Public Policy, I'm pleased to welcome you to the annual George Washington Leadership Lecture. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a couple things about the Price School. We always get different audiences to these events, and I like to say a little bit about the school. You know, our school was founded 90 years ago in 1929, and it came about by some advocacy groups petitioning the university to create our school. And what's interesting about it is one of the most prominent advocacy groups was a group of women, and we actually have a picture of them. They have these beautiful, you know, back then they wore these lovely hats and everything. And they were instrumental in creating our school that would really help professionalize public administration and urban planning. And they were very concerned about the corruption and so on in government. So that's how we got started. We were also from the beginning a school very interested in civic participation, as well as the relationship between government and citizens. And early on, as a school, way before globalization became, you know, sort of a buzzword, we were going around the world helping to educate and train public administrators and urban planners in various countries, really all around the world. So we've had an international mission from the beginning. And these values really are central to our school today, and it defines our mission, which is really to improve the quality of life for people in their communities here, but also abroad. And so this year, in 2020, in January, we're actually starting a new semester. We're starting a new year, but we're also starting a new decade. And it's our next decade towards our 100th anniversary. And we're very excited about that. And so we're going to be on a mission, a really strong mission during that decade to make the world a better place. We're going to continue with that mission. Now, the George Washington Lecture Series is an important part of our school's mission-focused efforts and our desire to build up community leaders committed to public service and to the public good. It was launched 6 years ago now, time flies, as a partnership between the USC Price School and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. And together we are exploring President Washington's lifelong accomplishments, his remarkable leadership, and his professional achievements, and of course his lasting legacy. Now, the collaboration was really made possible by two very special people, Mary Beth and Hal Borthwick. And Mary Beth is a distinguished USC alumna and serves as the Vice Regent for California of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which is the association that really runs Mount Vernon from the beginning. And I'd like you to please join me in thanking them for their generosity in supporting this event. Now, in keeping with our mission, one of our goals at USC Price is to bring together innovators who can help us deepen our understanding of leadership in different areas of policy and governance. And thanks to our partners at the Fred W. Smith National Library, we have the opportunity to really do that this evening. Tonight, we're going to be discussing leadership in the challenges of national security. Now, this topic fits directly with the legacy of George Washington. During the Revolutionary War for Independence, it was General Washington who led the troops in that battle. And as President Washington, he was Commander-in-Chief of the military of the newly formed United States of America. It is also especially timely and relevant topic today given the multiple threats to our security from domestic and international non-state actors, from hostile and dangerous states, and from the changing balance of global power. In addition, it is appropriate for our school to be involved in this as well, as we invest further in security studies, something that is a priority for me as dean, and public safety. And we also oversee, many of you know, USC's ROTC programs. So as we emerge from a world with a bipolar power shared between the United States and the former Soviet Union, and enter an evolving multipolar world with significant changes to the balance of power, we are facing the kinds of challenges that George Washington faced in his era. And in this election year, this volatile election year, President Washington's values, and especially his leadership that rose above partisanship, are particularly relevant. He was a strong leader across political factions, and to me, the bravest thing he did was after two terms decided to step down as president, paving the way for other leaders regardless of party affiliation, which was set at the beginning, not a military dictatorship, but the kind of democracy that we enjoy today. So I'm really glad to be here tonight to hear the lecture and discussion on this timely topic. So tonight's lecture will be a panel discussion with Deputy Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Ariella Lowenstein, New York Times senior writer and national security correspondent David Sanger, and Dr. Errol Southers, a former FBI agent, currently the director of the Price School Safe Communities Institute and professional in national and homeland security. And the panel discussion will be moderated by USC Price professor Dr. David Sloan. Now, before we start the panel, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Butterfield, Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith Library for the Study of George Washington. Dr. Butterfield is a noted scholar of American history and a specialist in the founding era. He's got a rather well-known book called The Making of Tocqueville's America, Law and Association in the Early United States, and it's a prize-winning examination of early American legal history. And we're really grateful to have this partnership and to have him here with us today. So, Dr. Butterfield.
We live in interesting, precarious, and dangerous times, as we're about to discover in greater detail than we may even want to know. We're about to discuss some of the new and ever-changing threats to our peace and safety, both at home and around the world, despite the fact that the United States is and remains the world's greatest power. Our founding generation, about whom you've heard a lot today if you've been listening to the impeachment proceedings, lived in a precarious and dangerous time. And the new United States of America was decidedly not an international superpower. It's important, especially on this day, to take stock of the many threats that face the American people. We've heard a lot today, if you've been paying attention again to these impeachment proceedings, about how the founding generation thought about dangers to the republic. They were quite reasonably anxious, even frightened, about what the future would hold. They were concerned about unchecked power. They were concerned about the danger posed by political leaders who held themselves above the law. But don't make the mistake of thinking that they were otherwise optimistic and carefree about the future of the nation. They too lived in a world dense with dangers. In George Washington's presidency, so the first 8 years under our new Constitution, the young United States had to navigate its way in a world where there were superpowers, but the U.S. wasn't one of them. Most notably, Great Britain and France. Spain was also near their level, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. And the two most powerful nations in the world were at war with one another and had brought many other European nations into that struggle. The U.S. was an infant in a world of men at war. On this side of the Atlantic, the new United States found themselves surrounded by European colonies, military posts, vast territorial claims by these superpowers. More important still were the Native American nations, some friendly to the United States, but most not, who remained powerful and, in George Washington's view, should be handled only diplomatically. On those occasions where the new nation took a stronger hand, such as when General Arthur Sinclair led an army into the Ohio Territory in 1791, they met with disaster. More than 1,000 men of Sinclair's force died in battle with the Western Confederacy in what has been called, to this day, still the worst defeat in the history of the United States Army. In short, George Washington presided over a time when the Republic was facing real struggles. And in fact, it almost the world in which the founding occurred almost certainly helps to explain the vast powers given to the presidency under Article 2. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 70 wrote very clearly that in a time of war, quote, "the energy of the executive is the bulwark of the national security." So here tonight, as we think about the challenges that we face around the world, I think it's a good opportunity to look very briefly, just for a few minutes, at Washington's example of executive leadership during this time of trial, during these early days of the new republic in his presidency. How did Washington believe he could keep Americans safe and keep the United States of America a republic in a dangerous world? We all know that Washington had a lot to say on these points. Most famously, of course, there's the farewell address, which he had published in September of 1796 when he decided not to run for that third term of office, which he surely would have won because he won the previous two unanimously. He called for a United States that stood clear of permanent alliances, involvement in foreign affairs. The young nation should seek harmony and commercial intercourse with all nations, certainly, but it should keep itself removed from direct involvement militarily abroad. And this young America, as perhaps today, national security was as much a question of internal cohesion as it was of that external, outward-looking policy. And so Washington also called in the same address for a strong union. He cautioned against political partisanship, sectional division. The nation had great hopes, he would say in this farewell, only so long as we remain one people under an efficient government. There was another kind of domestic conflict that Washington believed the new nation could and hopefully would rise above. When someone of Washington's generation looked at history, they knew that one of the great seedbeds of war, of bloodshed and violence, was religious intolerance. The wars of religion that had racked Europe over the previous centuries, our founding generation declared, may well never happen here because they were, and were proud to be, the first nation in the history of the world that saw a full separation of church and state, and over time, universal religious freedom. They saw it as both just and prudent. So, of course, we know about George Washington's famous letter to the Truro Synagogue in August of 1790, where he notes in particular that all possess in this new nation alike a liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights, that is, to worship as they chose. But of course, official religious liberty was not a panacea. They needed to find a way to maintain harmony internally and externally. And so when you look at Washington's efforts to preserve American security, particularly on the international stage, there's one year in his presidency that I think stands out above the rest. It's the year 1795. He's nearing the end of his second term, and in his seventh annual message to Congress, what we now call the State of the Union address, which he delivered in December of 95, Washington described where the nation was. And it was in a much better shape than it was the year before. The previous year, in 1794, he'd had to report in that same State of the Union that there was an armed insurrection that endangered the Republic. This is the famous Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Washington himself had to help call up and lead a force to put down the insurrection. But when he addressed Congress in 1795, he was able to say that the threat had been resolved. He'd even pardoned anyone involved that had been convicted of a capital crime. But the address of 1795 is a great snapshot, and it's one I just want to spend a couple of minutes on, that devotes much more attention to American security on the international stage than to these kind of domestic questions, because in that year, Washington had found a way to essentially, through a series of treaties, put the nation on a solid footing for the near future. There's the Treaty of Greenville, which ended the long and persistent Native American conflicts in the Old Northwest, the Ohio Territory in particular. Washington announced that the termination of the long, expensive, and distressing war. As he described other challenges with Native Americans and the relationships with this young and fragile United States, we see a distinctively Washingtonian approach to relationships with these other powers, and that was an emphasis on the need for the Americans, the young United States, to be just and restrained if they expected the same in return. As he wrote about the relationships with the Creeks and the Cherokees in the Southwest, he said to Congress, if we expect the Native Americans to pursue justice, quote, it is indispensable that there shall be competent means of rendering justice to them. We needed to find a way, in short, to prevent white settlers from settling unlawfully on Native American land. That same year saw treaties with North Africa, both with Morocco and Algiers, showing, by the way, that the United States was already on a global stage and helped to secure peace there for at least another decade until Jefferson's presidency. That same year also saw a treaty with Spain, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, or the Pinckney's Treaty, which settled the southern border of the United States just above Florida and also opened up navigation in the Mississippi, Most famously, the treaty with Great Britain, the famous Jay Treaty, that the Chief Justice of the United States actually went across the Atlantic to negotiate, secured a peace with Great Britain, one that was deeply unpopular because it seemed as if maybe the Americans had conceded too much. But Washington's goal wasn't a win, it was peace. And he was able to keep the nation at peace with Great Britain and to maintain neutrality at a time when Britain and France were at war. To be sure, in 1795, Washington was optimistic that the nation could face its challenges. His leadership in finding diplomatic solutions to problems, his emphasis on acting justly to those from whom the United States might expect the same, these were all things that I think are valuable for us today, just as they were in the 1790s. Certainly national unity and a dedication to the public good, to the republic, to res publica, that is to public things, not to private or narrow interests, was as important to Washington as anything ever was. And he sought to chart a course for that republic in dangerous waters, a challenge that the United States still faces today. I'm excited to sit down and listen to the panelists discuss some of the challenges and some of the possibilities we have in front of us. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Tonight, we examine current issues in national security through the lens of George Washington's legacy and contemporary efforts and leadership. We live in a moment with far too many national security issues, ranging from Syria to the Ukraine, Iran, to North Korea, China, to Venezuela, to possibly cover anywhere close of all of them. So we're going to try to cover a bunch of them. And we're going to do that for about 50 minutes to an hour. And then we're going to ask you to cover a few more by asking good questions. So please, if you think about it now, you might want to write it down quick or use your phone, your little notes thing on your phone, to remember it when we get there. We are all very much going to look forward to this. The reason I mention the digital program is I'm not going to go through individual biographies. I'd rather just get going. And so please do take a moment to, even if you don't have it in front of you now, we have an illustrious panel, and you'll find them working throughout. The biographies are great. So Kevin established a broad framework for our conversation, but I think we have to start with the first thing he said, and that is, do the impeachment hearings affect how the world sees the United States? And do they affect the ability of the United States government to respond to internal or external hate crimes and terrorism or other activities? Or are the hearings simply American theater to which nobody outside the Beltline and a few academics really care? Ariella?
Oh, sure. So if you read my bio, you know that I work for ADL. We are a 501c3, so we don't take partisan positions. Just want to point that out so I can secure my job. But I will say that I think, you know, and what I've been talking about a lot is the fact that whatever your position is on the impeachment hearings, whatever political party you vote for, you know, we look at values, not partisanship, and we have seen the devaluation of American society. We have seen polarization occur like no other, and unfortunately with polarization, when people take sides, they leave a vacuum, and within that vacuum comes hate. The extremes are able to infiltrate that vacuum and bring in their viewpoints as legitimate. And so I think that polarization makes us, unfortunately, less safe than we have been in a long time. When we cannot sit across from our fellow person and have a conversation and agree to disagree, that is something that makes us actually less safe. And so that is kind of how I view, that's our lens of how we view what's going on right now in the world, is through that polarization, and unfortunately through that comes through hate.
David?
Well, a few things about the impeachment. I don't work for a 501c, but I'm on the news side of the New York Times. It's what we refer to as an involuntary nonprofit.
Correct.
And so I'm not on the opinion side. So let me give you as much as I can a sort of a bit of analysis of where I think the impeachment takes us and then what its security implications are. The first thing to say about this is that it's the first presidential impeachment that actually turns on an issue of foreign policy and national security. Andrew Johnson's did not, right? Richard Nixon's never got to a complete impeachment. He resigned before that, but it was based on a domestic break-in, domestic scandal effort to manipulate an election at home. Bill Clinton's was about a sexual affair, but it was not something that dealt with either domestic policy or foreign policy. And Donald Trump's is completely different. And I thought it was really interesting. I didn't hear all of Representative Schiff today, but I heard a good deal of it. And naturally, he went back to Federalist 65, which we've all had to go reread. This is actually my second time in my 25 years in working in Washington that I've had to go back and read Federalist 65 because we're covering an ongoing impeachment. And interesting as Federalist 70 is, as Kevin reminded us, if you haven't gone back to read 65, read it before you get to our biographies. It's actually more important for what you're doing right now. Because what's fascinating about this impeachment is it goes to the core fear the founders had about foreign involvement in elections at a time when we seemed far more vulnerable than we have thought we were, really between Washington's time and 2016, when we discovered what the Russians were doing, to foreign manipulation. And when you hear this argument that you've heard in the past couple of days, that you have to commit a crime and that abuse of power and so forth is not an impeachable offense. I'm no lawyer. I don't play one at the newspaper. We have several. But it doesn't seem to me to be consistent with one's reading of Federalist 65, where Hamilton was pretty clear. The second thing I would say about this impeachment effort is that it has profoundly affected not only domestic views of the United States, which are, as Ariel has pointed out, quite split. Read the interviews we have in the Times today on the website where we just did a sampling of voters around the country and their views. And of course, they range from this is highly impeachable and he should be out now to what are you guys talking about, right? But abroad, there is a segment of people who think, oh, this is political theater. And there is a segment of people who think that what President Trump did shows that our alliances are fundamentally up for sale. And that the core of that argument, if you believe it, is that by going to a country that is not a treaty ally, but with whom we were trying to help, and by basically saying that the aid the United States is providing, not just for Ukraine's safety, but for our safety, because this is fundamentally not about Ukraine, it's about Russia and containment of a new and activist Russia, that fundamentally what the president was doing was putting his own election prospects ahead of a congressional intent signed by the president to aid a country and aid the United States by pushing back on an adversary. And that gets back directly to what you read in Federalist 65. And we all think we know how this is going to end, and I suspect it will end with the president remaining in office. And he will, of course, claim that the fact that he was not convicted was vindication. And there may not even be a majority of votes, much less 2/3, to convict him. In fact, based on the party line votes last night, I doubt that there are a majority of votes. But what will be left in the minds of many foreigners is a view, I think, that what Americans like to cast as steadfast alliances in our interests and in our allies' interests are now tainted by a political calculus, or what Fiona Hill wonderfully referred to in that great Scottish lilt she has as a domestic political errand. And that played again today when Representative Schiff was putting some clips from the House hearings up. And that one really lingered.
Errol?
And so if I could take a bit of Ariela's comments and some of David's and just say this. First, this impeachment does come at a very interesting time. And for some organizations, this impeachment was predictable. But I'm going to say, as one of Dean Knott's professors of national and homeland security, and my motto in my class has always been, in the words of the famous data scientist W. Edwards Deming, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So let's just look at some facts that have happened over the last several years. Last year was the 4th deadliest year on record for domestic extremist-related killings in the United States. The opening comments, the remarks that were made, we talk about dangers to the Republic. So while I am obviously concerned about our national security, when I think about threats from abroad, I think we can't have national security if we don't have homeland security. We have had a 21% increase, and I work very closely with Ariella and the ADL and have for years, a 21% increase in anti-Semitic crimes over the last year. For those of you who follow the ADL, you know that they have the largest increase last year they've ever had in the last 40 years that they've actually tracked those crimes. I get concerned when I see events like this past Monday, where we have law enforcement officers who've decided what they are going to and not going to enforce because it's quote unquote unconstitutional. So we're at a very fragile and very dangerous point, in my opinion, in this country. When we have people who call our center to give talks on homegrown violent extremism or protecting houses of worship instead of other things. I always felt in the years that I've done this, and I've done this for a long time, that even really bad people had places they wouldn't go. And by that I mean, I never thought that they would decide to target our students in our schools or our worshipers in their houses of worship. And that's where we are. So I think this is bigger than the impeachment. It is about really what kind of country we are, what kind of people we are as a nation as we go through this now. This past week, I was on the news last week because we had intelligence from the National Counterterrorism Center in DC. And the title of the threat was Persistent Threat of Terrorist Ambush Attacks on First Responders, because police and firefighters are the most visible signs of our government. What was really interesting about that was that they thought this uptick in possible threats to our first responders was going to be as a result of killing Qasem Soleimani, and then the response by attacking our bases in Iraq, and somehow that's going to spin into some kind of threat we have here at home from Hezbollah. It's almost like a trifecta. And so while we have a situation now where police officers and public safety officers are always living in that kind of world, it's now exacerbated by the actions we're taking globally. So we have a very interesting time here It's going to be very challenging. It is certainly a call for some leadership, but I am very concerned, as are most of my colleagues, about the threats we have here at home and shoring that up if we're going to demonstrate any kind of posture to have a national security front.
So one of the things that we know is true is the world has changed in many ways since George Washington. I was thinking about what Kevin was going to say, and I was wondering, were George Washington's state documents carried by passengers on ships across oceans for months more vulnerable to theft? Or are ours? When we live in a new cyber world where keeping a secret seems almost impossible, how would each of you evaluate our current policies and practices on cyber? And how do they affect our national security policies, both in the country, or our homeland security policies in the country, and our national securities outside? David?
Well, he's picking on me first because I wrote last year, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which is a book that basically makes the argument that cyber has become the primary way that nations conduct short of war operations against each other now. And that goes to a question of reach. We spent most of the Cold War worried about an ICBM threat from Russia, lesser degree from China, then, of course, from Pakistan, India, North Korea, and the small other grouping of nations that had nuclear capability. There are only 9, which would have shocked Kennedy, who thought by this time there would be dozens. In cyber, by the time I completed the book in the middle of 2019, or the book came out in the middle of 2019, we counted 35 countries that are capable of sophisticated cyber operations, of which the threat, David, that you discussed, which was theft of data, is, to my mind, the least dangerous and the least interesting.
Well, not
Yes.
if you were George Washington.
Not if you were George Washington. And George Washington had data theft issues, and Benedict Arnold was a big part of that, right? But not the only part. And the reason that I say it's less interesting is that there has always been theft of data. All we have done in the cyber age is sped up the volumes of it, right? So Washington worried about the theft of battle maps and battle orders. Later, we became adept at stealing or intercepting mail. We created units of the US government to do that to our adversaries. Then we got good at intercepting telephone conversations. So no big surprise when we moved to the digital age and we all started emailing and all other kinds of electronic communications, we found ways to go steal that, right? And that's what the NSA did from its founding in 1952 through to the mid-90s. When I say that it's less interesting, it doesn't necessarily mean it's less important. People still steal data. You take a look at the F-35 the Chinese have built, you look at our F-35, they look remarkably the same, with one big difference. The Chinese have figured out how to make it for a third less than we're making ours. But what we worry about in cyber, what I worry about, are 3 very different threats. The first is data manipulation, that we keep so much data in our databases, personal and others, that the ability of somebody to go in and attack you merely by manipulating data is very high. And here, you don't need to go in and reprogram missiles if you simply got into the healthcare database of the Pentagon and you changed the blood type of every soldier and sailor and Marine in America. You could imagine the huge amount of damage you could do. And as you pointed out, that could be a domestic actor and more likely an insider than somebody abroad. The second is the ability to go conduct actions of destruction of physical equipment and places and things using cyber means. In other words, destroying facilities, equipment, military sites, police activities, critical infrastructure that previously you would have needed to bomb or send in saboteurs. And that's our worry when we worry about the Russians being inside the electric grid, that they would turn off all the power from San Francisco to LA or Boston to Washington or anything in between. But here we have to remember that the pioneer in all of this was not the Russians, not the Chinese. It was, of course, us.
Yes.
And the seminal moment was 10 years ago with the decision by President Bush, accelerated by President Obama, to conduct what was called Operation Olympic Games. You all knew as Stuxnet, and that was the American-Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. And we can certainly argue that it was justified to go off and do it, and it was a way of doing it without triggering a war. But the fact of the matter is, it got used by every one of our adversaries to say, if the United States feels it can use cyber against facilities, so can we. And we did it without thinking very much about the fact that we are the most wired society on Earth, and therefore the most vulnerable society on Earth. And the third form of action, it's barely cyber at all, but we use cyber means to accelerate it, is the kind of information warfare that you saw happen in the Russian actions in 2016 in the election, what the Iranians and the Russians tried, largely unsuccessfully, in the midterms, what we've now seen happen across Europe and other places, and what we fear could happen in 2020.
Ariella?
So when we look at cybersecurity, which we are not experts on, what we look at is more of the cyber hate world. And not only the cyber hate world, but what are these, domestic players looking at, domestic and international players looking at, and how are they using the internet to benefit them? And there are multiple ways that makes it less safe in the cyber world, including, they build their communities out of the cyber world. And so just as we use the cyber world to build our, to contact our families and build our communities, they are using it for the same reason. So communication between people overseas, there's been this globalization of white supremacy like we've never seen before, of foreign actors now having influence and both sides having influence over each other. And so our world centers around looking at how hate is transmitted across the cyber world. And so for us, cybersecurity is not something, when our center on technology and society, which is located in Silicon Valley, is trying to grasp the levels of hate on the internet. And as you can imagine, it is so vast and so large, nobody has actually captured the numbers of hate on the internet. And so for us, it's more about what's being transmitted, what kind of plans, where they can plan bombings, where they can do all of their due diligence and their pre-attack surveillance without even leaving the benefit of their home, right? They can just look at Google Maps, right? And you can find different security flaws in different types of buildings. And so our concern is the usage of the internet, how they're using it, how they're exploiting it, and how they're not only exploiting it, but making money off of it. And so there are various ways that we feel like the cyber world is something that we have yet to have control over. Our laws have not caught up with the type of threats that there are today. David touched on the sharing of information, and we're dealing a lot now with what's called doxing, right? Where people put other people's information, private personal information on the internet in order to set trolls against them and to have their lives threatened. We're talking about swatting, which is another activity that has become a major international issue, where somebody even internationally can call the SWAT officers to a house and they end up killing a person, an innocent person who had the SWAT officers called on them. And so we're dealing with a whole bunch of both domestic and international, looking at the landscape. It really does generate a whole new group, a whole new world, where the virtual world crosses into the reality of what we're experiencing now, both with hate crimes and with terrorism, domestic and international.
And so if I could go off of Ariella's comments, obviously our extremists and the terrorist attacks we've seen recently, there have been some demonstrations of their capacity. Many people don't know that Faisal Shahzad, who tried to, fortunately, unsuccessfully detonate a bomb in Times Square, there was a cyber component to that attack as well, which was kind of interesting. But more importantly, what I'm concerned about, and others in the intelligence community, are our relationships with our international partners as it relates to our cyber capacity and our cyber, I hate to use this term, and David agrees with me, the security of our cyber systems, I'll say it that way. Because we've done some things, and like everybody here, I travel quite a bit and I have partners overseas, and we've done some things recently that at least suggest that we're not exercising the diligence we have for many years. Give
us an example.
Well, the use of iPhones by some of our elected officials when they decide to communicate with people. The discussion about perhaps information that should be shared in what we call a SCIF, which is where, I know in the movies they take classified documents and throw them on the table. But that's not how it really happens. And if anybody here who's familiar with a SCIF, and that's a sensitive compartmentalized information facility, that's where we read classified information. It's, to say that it's bomb-proof is an understatement, because that's the standards they have to meet. It's the only place you can look at it. There are no electronic devices taken inside. You've got to go through a whole set of procedures to get into that facility. There's a whole set of procedures to have a clearance to be allowed in that facility. And then there are several levels of clearances that people have to have access. And what we're demonstrating to some of our partners, because of some of the activities that have taken place here in the last year or so, is that perhaps we're not being as careful and as cautious and as diligent as we could be. Then we talk about voting. And that's my biggest concern. When you vote in November, will it really count? It's really amazing to me that we have countries that don't have anywhere near the resources or technology that we have, and they have secure voting systems, and we don't. And so as we talk about cyber, I worry about the security of our country in that regard, and I worry about our democracy, a functioning democracy where a vote really isn't one because you won't know. And so that's the concerns that most people have now. Our Pentagon has been hacked. Several years ago, we had military records compromised. People with clearances had to be worried about whether or not your information about yourself was out there in some other country's possession because of the hack. So we do have some real concerns. And we're not unlike any other country. We look for hackers because whoever's got the best hackers is going to win. But that's the game we play. And it's a very, very dangerous game. It's one that's always gone on. But we have some real concerns here, not just about our national security, but ourselves in the way of our democracy and what our vote really means.
So let's follow up on that. We have entered a new presidential election season. That's presuming we ever left the last presidential season. We have reports on Iranian efforts to subvert President Trump's campaign, while others are definitely, as Errol has already suggested, concerned about the seemingly unfulfilled hopes of protecting our actual ballot boxes. Will cyber bandits, as we put up on our little board, help decide our next president?
Well, it depends in large part, David, I think, on which part of this threat that you're most concerned about. And you've raised, rightly, the voting machine process. You've also got the voting registration process. And then you have what Ariel was referring to, which is the influence process. So break them down. The good news about the voting machine process is that the voting machines that we use in the United States are so different from state to state, so disconnected from each other, so outdated, so analog, that the system is so old and creaky, it's actually hard to hack. Which is to say, you would actually physically have to be in place in many places. Now, that alone is not enough of a protection, because if you read about a small group of precincts that get hacked into, particularly in an election where, let's face it, we think it's going to get decided in 3 states, and in the last presidential election by 77,000 people, if you believe that there was hacking in a small group of those, your mind will go to the whole system is hacked. And if you were President Trump and you're following the playbook that he followed in 2016, you're likely to talk about how the system is rigged so that if he loses by a small number, in a very close thing, the most dangerous period of time we may enter are those 90 days between the end of the election and inauguration, because there could be an argument about whether or not the numbers were hacked. I'm less worried about the voting machines than I am about the registration system. I'm worried about the registration system because it's outward facing, it's connected to the internet in the way that the machines are not. And the greatest danger there is right at the closing of the registration period. We know that the Russians got into the registration systems in all 50 states, that in Illinois and Arizona they actually took data out. And our big concern is what happens if they can put data back in. And David, you go to the polls and they look and they say, wow, this is terrific. How do you like New Mexico since you moved there 6 months ago?
I enjoy it.
Yeah. And you can imagine the chaos that can cause. The solution to this, if I was czar for a day, unfortunately for the country I never will be, is I would require paper backup of all voting systems in America, where you get to sign off on that paper output. That doesn't mean you can't vote electronically, but there's got to be something that comes out in paper that you can check. Mm-hmm. And in the best of systems, Microsoft has actually designed something like this. A label goes on it where you can go home and on the internet, you can track it with the super fancy technology that you use to figure out whether FedEx is actually moving a package to your house, right? And the fact that we can figure out what the chain of custody is for a FedEx package with a check in it, or a package of light bulbs from Amazon, but we can't do that with a ballot, I don't get that. Mm-hmm. On the influence side, then our bigger concern is, how do you make sure that what you have is authentic speech? Which is to say, if I want to engage in the kind of ads that the Internet Research Agency engaged in 2016, I have a favorite one I show in a group of slides for Texas secession. A lot of my relatives live in Texas. A few of them might sign up to Texas secession from the country. But if I want to say that, I'm well within my First Amendment rights. Our concern is if that ad is made to look like one of us put it up, and in fact it was done in St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, right? That's the big concern. And so what we're worried about in this coming election is making sure we understand who is sending the message. Mm-hmm. And in the cyber world, that's often difficult to tell.
Ariel?
Yeah, I mean, misinformation is a huge problem. And the fact that we are not educated consumers of data is something that also is a problem. The fact that we had to create a curriculum about misinformation and bias in the media is something that we want to try to make our youth more knowledgeable consumers of what is and is not valid media. And that's not to say that we tell them what apps to look at and what news sources to look at, but actually look at the source of where it's coming from and to do more research than just seeing it come up on your Facebook feed or seeing it come up on your Twitter feed. The amount of misinformation that's out there and the amount of information that's out there that people will use against you is incredible. To give you an example, in my line of work, there are things that I search for on Facebook that you normally wouldn't search for at home, right? You don't go home and look for swastikas. I look for swastikas, right? I'm looking for something, whatever it may be in the white supremacist, neo-Nazi symbology world. And I will tell you that when I do search for that at work, then consequently on my Facebook feed, there will come up for ads of white supremacist neo-Nazi t-shirts, right? And the amount of people who are watching or seeing this or getting the information of what I'm searching for, not realizing who I am or what I'm looking for, is pretty remarkable of the information that they can send you. And I think that that's something that that David touched upon. This misinformation, the amount of information that is thrown at us is pretty much unintelligible at times. We can't weed through it. There's too much information, and so what we do is we silo the information and we go towards the silo where we fit. Right, where our viewpoint is, and it's our echo chamber. We hear over and over and over again, and we have our views, our biases substantiated, and the internet does that. So I think our concern is this: that we're not really great consumers of information. We have our echo chambers, and so people will be driven in the way that they're driven based on what they look up on the internet and what their sources are, and not knowing that this may be from St. Petersburg, Russia, or it may be from a complete and utter fallacy or conspiracy theory. Without having any kind of valid information behind it. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories that you can look at that turned into violent action, right? You can look at Pizzagate, right? That was where, online, there was an accusation of Clinton and somebody else being involved in a child pornography ring out of the basement of a family pizza restaurant. And somebody showed up there with an AR-15, right? Now, luckily, nobody was hurt or injured, and the shooting did not take place. But you're talking about something that started online.
The guy got a few shots off. He just didn't.
He didn't hit anybody.
We know this is a neighborhood pizza place in our neighborhood. Yeah.
And he didn't hit anybody. Thank God.
Yes,
yeah. But that started from a misinformation campaign. So the fact is that this misinformation coming from the cyber world is actually turning into hate, violence, bigotry, and terrorism in the real world. And all you have to do is look at every single shooter that we've had since Pittsburgh, since Robert Bowers, who went on and said, screw your optics, I'm going in, to his manifesto, from his manifesto to Christchurch, from Christchurch to Poway, from Poway to Austin. You have to look at the lineage of those things to see that all of that is all cyber information. All of that is put up on the internet, and people are using that for inspiration. They're using it to commit acts of horror and violence on our very own turf. And so, again, like Errol, while I'm concerned about threats from abroad, I'm really very concerned about threats from our own home. And that's something that we need to look at, especially with the amount of misinformation that comes out.
And so, David, I don't want to get too far afield of your question about votes, and I'll address that, but I just want to, if I could, follow up on Ariella's comments about the echo chamber and misinformation. And the course I teach this semester is on homegrown violent extremism. And my students always ask me the first week or two as they're working on their policy paper, how much can I search before somebody you used to work for knocks on my door? And I used to say, I always say that, don't worry about it. They know you're students and you're doing research, you'll be fine. Well, not too long ago, a doctoral student here, who's now a professor here, who will go unnamed, was doing some research because we were looking at critical infrastructure in California. We were looking at some likely targets if we were an international actor, and where might that be? Well, that might be the port of LA Long Beach, because if you shut down the port, you shut down the Western Hemisphere. So we decided to make it real sexy and said, could we get a suitcase nuke into the port? And she started doing extensive research on suitcase nukes and the port. Well, when the FBI knocked on her door and she mentioned she knew me, that didn't help. But the point is that did happen. But I will say this, back to the echo chamber. Ariel is right, and you can find what you want. We find that like-minded individuals, particularly those looking towards extremist activities, will do that. Dylan Roof is a classic example. Dylan Roof was of the belief that blacks kill more whites in America, and he Googled that, and he got to a site that took him down a rabbit hole that gave him misinformation that that data was true, which is absolutely incorrect, and sat at home and decided, you know, those organizations out there like the Klan are not doing what they're supposed to. I'm going to do something noble and I'm going to take care of it. And the rest is history. So they can do that. But I want to go back to David's point about the voting machines and the paper backups. What's lacking here is not the technology. What's lacking here is political will. We haven't done a thing different since 2016. We have the same machines with the same problems, with the same voter registration methodologies, and we have bills sitting in the Senate right now to shore up our cyber systems that have not been voted on, that people have proposed. There's no political will. I'll say it. We haven't changed a thing. What's the definition of insanity? So when November comes and the outcome is what it is, no one should be surprised. We get the government that we vote for.
Well, that's really an upbeat
Or not.
way to end.
David, I just want to make it slightly more upbeat because Erwin raised the port of Long Beach, and when first book I did was a book called The Inheritance, which was about what President Bush was leaving President Clinton, and I spent some time at the port of Long Beach looking at their nuclear portal system to make sure that
We put those in.
And it was a great thing that they put those in. There was a little bit of a problem, which is that they kept getting all these false positives where you put things through and people thought you were taking radioactive material through them. And it turned out that what was setting them off was Chinese-made toilets. Think about that for a minute. But anyway.
And two things. Granite.
That'll do it. For your granite counter, which are coming through for the granite countertops you've been putting in your kitchen.
And believe it or not, bananas. Potassium.
And then they took one of these things and they took it out near Las Vegas to where we do our nuclear testing site, and they set up one of them, and they put through what was basically a mock-up of Little Boy, which was the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. And of course, as you've seen the pictures, it's shielded in metal, and they put it through the thing. It never went off. So there you go.
David, I don't know that makes me feel
It probably doesn't.
more upbeat. But can we, I want to come back to this stuff, the homegrown terrorism, in a minute. But let's take a step back and talk about our current president. And again, we're not here to pick on President Trump. David, in October, you wrote a column that I found I'm an historian. I found it really quite fascinating, where you characterized his take on foreign policy and national security as a 1930s view of how to defend the nation. And would you talk a little bit about how he imagines America? And we often talk about America first, and we have all these slogans that we talk about, but how has it played out that he really imagines us back in a different era than when this cyber era we talk so much about?
Well, David, I have a confession to make that deals with America first. The phrase came out of the first of two interviews that Maggie Haberman and I did with then candidate Trump in 2016 when we were doing interviews on the foreign policy views of the candidates. I'm just about to begin that process again with them. And we sat down with the president in, I think it was March, or then candidate, March of 2016. And as we got into a discussion of his views of national security, it was pretty clear that his view was that you build up a big military, but you bring it back within your borders. And then if anybody touches you or your interests, you strike out at them. Mm-hmm. The concept that we've all grown up with since World War II, which is one of forward deployment, right? That we have our bases in Germany, we have our bases in Japan, in South Korea, AFRICOM in Africa now, and so forth, is to try to choke off problems before they fester. And in fact, the failure of 9/11 was the failure to have enough forward presence to recognize what was coming together in Afghanistan that ultimately hit us in New York and Washington. That's not his view. His view is a very 1930s view of fundamentally isolationism, that we are not there to go out abroad. And you see this reflected in his view, which has some elements of merit, that our allies take advantage of us by not paying enough for our protection of them. The part he's missing is that a lot of those forward forces are for our own interests. And if you read the new book that just came out by two of my competitors at the Washington Post, I think the title is A Very Stable Genius, coming from his own words, there was an interesting scene at the Pentagon where a group of military leaders tried to explain this to him in 2017, right after his inauguration. And he basically rejected this view. So that is what I meant by the 1930s view. Now, at the end of that interview, trying to sum up all of what I had heard, I said to him in the last 10 minutes of it, you know, sir, what I'm hearing you say sounds a lot like the old America First movement. Thinking he would say, I'm no Lindbergh, I'm not an isolationist. Well, it turned out he hadn't actually heard about Lindbergh and the America First movement in the 30s. And he said to me, David, I really like the sound of that. Because, we're Americans. We should be America first. And the British should be British first. And the French should be French first. And all that. So this was a Friday. We wrote our story, appeared in the Sunday New York Times. Sunday night, he goes out to a rally. And Monday morning, I go downstairs in the kitchen. I'm making coffee for my wife. I turn on the TV, and there are excerpts from the night before, and he is shouting at the crowd, America first, America first. Now, I think he would have come to this sooner or later without the help of this interview. I think it was only a matter of time. That's what I just keep telling everybody. And my wife came down, and I'm pouring her a cup of coffee, and she watches this on TV, and in the way that only a spouse can be, wonderfully cutting, looks at me and says, I hope you're really proud of yourself.
We might have some students here who don't know about America First in the 1930s. Would you just give a quick?
It was a movement which came encapsulated by Lindbergh, the great aviator, who then became a political activist to keep us out of World War II. and who basically took the view what happens between Nazi Germany and the rest of Europe is their problem, not our problem, and we should stay out. And that movement gained a lot of traction until Pearl Harbor, when it suddenly disappeared.
No, one of the things that was true of America First that was it had a very deep, to my mind, evil underside. And that was, it was a very racist, very anti-Semitic
Yep, absolutely.
part of that movement. And I wonder, America First now resonates with our various communities, the Jewish community, the Muslim community. It has to be a difficult phrase to hear from the President of the United States.
I mean, I think, and I don't, ADL, we represent one portion of the Jewish community, and it's not, we're a civil rights organization. We were founded in the Jewish community, but we are, our mission is to fight anti-Semitism and bigotry of all kinds. And that was since its founding, because the founders realized that hate doesn't exist in a vacuum. So, normally one who hates Jews will hate others. And, when America First came out, thank you, David. I'm just kidding.
This will be on my tombstone.
It will be on your tombstone. I mean, that's amazing. But when it first came out and we heard about it, the CEO and national director of ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, decided to reach out to the White House. We always want to obviously assume goodwill. And so we discussed what America First actually meant, not only to the Jewish community, but to all minority communities. Obviously that argument was summarily rejected. And so once it was rejected, we realized he's actually using it on purpose, not by accident. So obviously it's very concerning to us when tweets of white supremacists get repeated by the President of the United States, when anti-Semitic caricatures get transmitted, again, by Twitter via the President of the United States, and when we go to explain and we are told basically by the administration, he means what he says and he says what he means, then obviously our take is, okay, well, he's allowing for this kind of hatred to be proliferated throughout the world. So it's not, it's very concerning, obviously, to all communities. And for anyone who knows the history of America First, it's something that we're very, very scared of. Not just the isolationist policies that were, but also the type of, you talk about evil underbelly of it, but the type of Nazism that it represented, because it really was part of the Nazi movement in the United States of America. And so that's something that we look very seriously at, we take very seriously, and it's very concerning to us for numerous reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's something where it was very disconcerting to hear.
So I have, for those of you who've been in my office, I have a very healthy, what we call challenge coin collection in my office. This is one. I keep this one with me because it's got the Pentagon with an eagle and a flag on the front. And it has the Pentagon the day after 9/11 when the flag was draped over it. This was given to me by Brad Burlingame. His brother Chuck was a pilot of Flight 77 who was forced into the Pentagon. America First and words and images and phrases mean very different things to very different people. America First was the slogan for the centennial celebration of the Ku Klux Klan. And they had challenge coins made that said America First, preserve racial purity, that they distributed that year. So when people hear certain phrases, like the people at RAL and I deal with, America first means something really different. That's code speak for them, coming from the President of the United States. Along with many other statements and many other actions that have happened that we assume mean something really noble, and they assume now is a wink and a nod to move forward. You'll hear those organizations talk about otherism. We've done nothing but that in the last several years here. And some people call it isolationism. We call it otherism. Other races, other nationalities, other religions. Diversity to these organizations is code speak for white genocide. And that's the reason that they've become more emboldened to do what they do. So we need to be very careful, and our leaders need to be very careful. And I would assume they've got people around them telling them what should and shouldn't be said or done to keep them out of political trouble. Because America First, as noble as it may sound, means something very different to me and others who look at this space.
Let's pick up on that and take it a little bit further. Saud McKenna was, as many of you, as if you signed up very early, we had hoped that Saud would also be on our panel tonight. And she asked us to send her regrets. She was called away to an interview in Europe and had to cancel her appearance. If you haven't read her book, it's remarkable. The title is I Was Asked to Come Alone, and it's a series of interviews with jihadists. And it is a brilliant book. It's really quite stunning. It's terrifying, so get ready. But she argues at the end that many people have made this overarching claim that there is currently a battle of civilizations between Judeo-Christianity in the Islam world, the Islamic world, the Muslim world. And she rejects that in her book and argues, and I'm going to quote her here, really what we have is a clash between those who want to build bridges and those who rather see the world in polarities. And I really don't want to talk about the president. I'm not really interested in him. But I am intrigued by how we as a society and as a world seem to be in a position where this is becoming more and more a reality. I ended this question the first time I wrote it that I was a little scared that the bridge builders were losing and the polarities were beginning to win. But I'm not imposing that on you. I'm just saying, where do you think we are? Is this sound right to you? Is this a reasonable way to think about what's going on inside and outside?
It's always been thus, right, throughout history. And nationalism and ethno-nationalism is always about whether you're preserving your group or integrating with other groups. I think it seems particularly strong to us right now for a few reasons. First, when we invented the internet, and it was largely an American invention, maybe not Al Gore, but it was American invention. We viewed it as a great unifying force. And you think about the first 15 years of the internet, that was our view of what would happen around the world. When I was White House correspondent at the end of the Clinton administration, then through the George Bush administration, you'd go to China with Bill Clinton, and he'd always end up at Beida, Beijing University, and he'd end up giving a speech, heard him do this a few times, that basically said, once China's on the internet, the Communist Party is finished, right? Because everybody's going to understand the freedoms that everybody else lives with and all that. And that we've made the same argument about North Korea. We've made the same argument about Iran. We've even made the argument about close allies like Japan, a place that has always viewed a sort of defined Yamato tribe view as, what the core of the country was about. And the internet was supposed to wipe this out. And what we're now seeing is the backlash from that. as people fear, white Americans fear a country in which they will no longer be the majority, and that's just a demographic fact. But you're seeing this in Germany as you saw the influx of Syrian refugees. You're seeing it in Hungary, in great form. You've seen it to some degree in Russia. And in an odd way, you're seeing it in China as well, even though it's more of a mixed group. You're seeing it certainly in their treatment of the Uyghur community and other Muslims. So we're seeing a backlash we've always seen, but I think what's happened because of the world of the internet and because we can communicate so well is that we're all understanding that this is happening globally in a way I don't think we understood in previous waves. It's just what Ariel just was saying before. The groups feed off of each other because they can communicate with each other and because they can see each other.
I'm going to ask that you hold for a second and ask if anyone out there would like to ask a question.
Thank you all so much. My question is the role of Silicon Valley in all of this. From what I've heard in other recent talks from generals, they're sort of living in la-la land, thinking that the internet, this great connector, they're so optimistic that they're saving the world, and they're very ignorant to the fact that the world is full of bad guys willing to do us harm, and they don't seem to think that they have a role to play in helping our government to keep us safe. And I think of it in the foreign policy world, and I think of it in your world of communications and the way that WhatsApp was used in Southeast Asia to go after and slaughter plenty of people. What role does Silicon Valley play? How do we compete in either engaging young graduates and talent, competing, whether it's $150,000 starting jobs working for the government or for Facebook? How do we sort of find that balance in bringing them into helping and playing a patriotic role in enlisting and keeping us safe?
So I think there's two things that really need to happen. One is our first, the government needs to come on board and create laws that make sense in the cyber age. And then I think that the Silicon Valley world needs to learn that there are consequences to their actions. And I think, and what has been happening is that they have been and have not been reacting in different ways, right? And so we saw it with just last week, Twitter took down ads that a neo-Nazi organization had purchased to go up out to certain people, right? And apologized for letting them buy it, although it should never have happened in the first place. And this is not a free speech issue. Let's be clear about this, right? People are claiming that their free speech rights will be negated, that there'll be chilled speech, that they won't be able to speak out. Those companies are not government, right? Those companies are private companies. They have terms of service that they need to enforce, and they are mostly about the dollars and cents, right? And what earns them money and what gets them visibility. And so the more visibility we give them, the more that they'll use whatever it is to engage the audience that they're engaging. And so we really need to show them that we can disengage from that information if necessary, that that's not the information that's going to engage us, right? We need to put our foot down as consumers in using this to show them that it's not acceptable to have this information on there or these people on there, whatever their viewpoints may be, whatever their extremist levels may be. If you haven't seen it, I highly suggest there was ADL gave an award actually, which was a very interesting one, to Sacha Baron Cohen. Borat for the kids in the audience, yeah? So Sacha Baron Cohen was given an award, a humanitarian award for ADL nationally. And he gave one of the most stirring speeches. It actually got like 1 million views on YouTube about the danger, how dangerous social media is, and how and how he, who has used this platform, is now disengaging from it. And it's a very, very interesting, and he calls upon the 6 leaders, what he calls the 6 people in Silicon Valley that are the leaders of this group of, information age kind of sharing, to really take ownership and accountability for what goes out on their platforms. So I think it's really interesting, that we're coming into an age now where we see different people actually disengaging from the internet, where they're saying we're going to shut down our Facebook pages, we don't want any more of it, where we're going to shut down our Instagram, we're going to shut this down because we don't want to take part in what's going on in the negative kind of way that it's happening. So I think it needs to come from us as consumers, but there also needs to be government regulations as well as regulations on through the companies themselves.
Thank you for a great discussion. There are only 400 questions that I have, but I'll just ask one. And that is, when you're talking about national security, be it fear from domestic actions or international actors, it seems that nationalism is one of these big factors. And it's insecurity that makes this nationalism possible, and that the internet and these other tools are able to utilize. And that's the parallel to the 1930s. When things are bad in China, in Britain, in the United States, for some people, the one thing that you can do is to mobilize against the other. And so Errol referred to otherism. And I was wondering if you could talk about that as a root of insecurity and then these nationalist responses to it. Yeah, so economic polarization, health insecurity, all of those kinds of things.
David?
I'll give a brief answer and be interested to hear from Errol as well on this. The oddity of this versus the 30s is this is happening at a time of fundamentally global boom, right? We've seen the United States in economic expansion. We've seen China lift more people out of poverty in the past 20 years than all the anti-poverty operations that we have done since World War II combined, just in sheer numbers. Now, of course, it has left people behind. It's left people without jobs because they've been automated out of it or other reasons. And that always leaves a welling of a sense of disparity. And we see it in our own society. Boy, do you see it in Chinese society. I mean, there are a lot of Rolls Royces rolling around outside Figueroa Street out here, but try Beijing sometime, okay? So when you get those disparities, even in a time of boom, you begin to get this sense of what have I been left out of?
I'll be brief too. Nationalism is not a problem. If we could take the 15 days, sorry, I'm a summer guy, so I'm going to stick with the Summer Olympics. If we could take the 15 days of the Summer Olympics and the way America acts and just multiply it forever, we'd be fine. It's 15 days in America where everybody decides the only team they want to win is the United States. Doesn't matter what sport, doesn't matter what that athlete looks like, doesn't matter what gender they are. For 15 days, this country is amazing. Then it goes away. Nationalism, as we discussed it this evening, starts to lead to intolerance. Intolerance is a core element of extremism. And there's a continuum there that extremism then goes on to foster some radical beliefs, and then we start to have problems. So while nationalism is good, there's obviously a dark side to a whole lot of things. It takes us down that road to where we then get to otherism when we decide it's just us. My race, my nationality, my gender, my religion. If you don't agree with me, you're the other. If you don't agree with me, you're the enemy. And there we have problems.
Another question?
Back to national security when it comes to our elections. We had leading person in the nation just resigned, I think in December, Philip Stark, because of the integrity of our voting systems. We had our own Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen, her report is still valid to this day. So yes, when Trump says it's rigged, those of us who've been involved in election integrity know it is. So that is a concern. The other concern I have, that has to do with organized crime within both political parties. And every election cycle, to me, it's pigs at the trough saying, oh, we need more voting machines. And they raided all the HAVA money back in the day. And we have the same problem every election cycle. So the other thing I have to say is my other concern with national security is our own local district attorney's race. When you have outside money from individuals like Soros trying to tip the scales, I think that is a real important national security issue, and we should address it.
Anybody?
I'll just take on the election machine part for just a moment. We made a mistake after the 2000 Hanging Chads election. And we began to move to an all-electronic voting system on the theory that if your voting machine looked more like your ATM, it would be familiar to you and it would record things electronically, and you wouldn't have this issue of holding up a ballot and trying to figure out whether it had been punched through and so forth. And we made the classic error of not thinking very hard about how you verify what that vote was. And now, 20 years later, it's come home to roost because we feel fundamentally insecure with systems where we can't get out and actually hold it and see it and come back and verify it. And that's what we're moving back toward. And one thing that's important to remember in the digital age is that while we largely benefit greatly, if I took away all your cell phones and you couldn't text your kids and you couldn't order on Amazon tonight, you'd need more than coffee out there to calm down, okay? But there are some things in the world you want to keep off the digital realm. Ballots are one of them. Right? It's the same reason you think hard about where you want to have your Alexa, you know? Keep it in the kitchen? Maybe. Bedroom? Maybe not. Okay? So you want to think hard about where you apply the technology. Now, to your issues of the other issues that you raised, including your Attorney General and money influence in elections and so forth. We've always had concern about money influence in elections, and Supreme Court decisions have altered some of that landscape as well. I'll leave that for others.
We can take one more question.
So you've talked about polarization in our echo chambers, and I want to know, in a historical context, is this different, or are we just talking about it and it's on social media? And how do we move forward if we think our neighbor is our enemy?
Oh, I wish I had the answer. I don't think that there's, so, we get asked a lot, are there more haters? Are there less haters? Are there, there's so many of them. And it's like, no, there aren't really more. They're just amplified more. They're louder. So to your point, I think historically speaking, I'm not sure we're in a very different time than other periods, and I am not a historian, so I will leave that to the experts in that area. I don't think that it's so different from other periods of time where we're on this constant roller coaster of, we're up, we're down, society is great, society is not great. I think it's kind of a roller coaster. So I don't think that we're in such, the difference is the amplification. The difference is that so many people that we're talking about it, but that we know about it, and many of us feel very helpless to do anything about it, right? And so I think where we try to talk about having civil discourse. And what shocks me all the time is that ADL had to come up with a curriculum about civil discourse. Like, whoever thought that we would have to do that again in the 2000s, in the 2010s. We never thought that was something that we would need to talk about, because civil discourse did exist at one point in time. So I don't think that I think we're very divided now. I don't think, and I think that people help us to stay divided, right? The messages that we get, the information that we get, it all helps to divide us. And so what we need to do, is to put down the devices, right, and actually have the conversation with each other. That's very hard to do. I have very, very young children, and my goal was to keep them off of whatever technology there was until now, where they go to school and now everybody has the technology, and so they want what they want. But just to kind of give you a very funny anecdote, during the 2016 election, my children were very young. I kept them off of no TV, no nothing, because I didn't want them to see any of what was going on. And my son came home from his preschool class and he says, "We're having an election at preschool." And I freaked out, because I was like, who are they voting for? What are they voting for? Like, what could they vote for? They're 3, right? What is their teacher telling them? And this is my mind, because I work for ADL, so I go to like the worst place in the world when he says something, and then I'm like, bring it back. What are you voting for? And he says, we're voting for whether we should have cornbread or corn during Thanksgiving. And I said, that is the greatest election I've ever heard in my entire life.
Who won?
They had equal votes down the middle, so they got both.
It's a democracy.
You're right. I mean, the point is that nobody is born like this. We are. This is a learned. Just as hate is a learned behavior, so is separation and polarization. When you look at kids, it doesn't exist in them. It is a taught behavior. They learn it from us, and so if we can try to regain that, and if we can try to teach them not to do it, I'm not sure we can save our generation, but hopefully we can save the next generation from becoming as polarized as we are right now, as divided as we are right now.
So I want to go back to the comment you made about Suad's book. I did a book talk with her, and your comment about bridge builders, and I'm an optimist. Don't be misled, and I'm not trying to minimize the threat, believe me, we live it, that's what we do. Don't be misled by that small fraction of people out there that are on social media and the news each night that make you think that everybody's a white supremacist, everybody's a neo-Nazi, everybody's a jihadist, and you should go shelter in place and buy enough guns to fill up a store. How interesting that here we are 2 days past Martin Luther King Day, when he actually was able to make himself known around the world in his mid-30s without one of these. Ariel is right. That's what we need to go back to, is having the conversation. I'm no different than any other young male of color in this country. I grew up in New Jersey. I wasn't a big fan of law enforcement. I had some things happen. And then one day my father said something to me I'll never forget when I had my complaints about the police. He said, you can't change the castle from outside the moat. That led to a long career, very productive and really fulfilling career in law enforcement. I just had 2 of my students here, one undergrad, one graduate student, both apply to the FBI this week. That's how we make the change. You want these organizations to change? We need to change them. And the next generation needs to change them, and I believe we can. But let's not think there aren't more bridge builders than those who want to destroy those bridges in America, because I don't believe that.
I'm tempted to leave it there, and I probably should, but I'm not gonna. David, the president had a good week last week when he got a trade agreement, or a part of a trade agreement with China. He had not said, over the last month or so, it hasn't been as good, hasn't been much momentum with Iran and North Korea around nuclear weapons. And I was curious, in your role as the analyst for the New York Times. Do you see over the near horizon, how is this going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Where are we going?
With Iran and North Korea, it's going to get worse because we've taken a set of steps where I think we've, in Iran's case, driven them faster to a position of opposition to us than I think they otherwise might have been, which is not to say that they were easy to deal with even after the nuclear accord. And with North Korea, the president convinced himself that the force of his own personality could make a difference in a way that previous presidents never succeeded. So let me just take those two apart. The president was a huge critic from those interviews I described forward in the 2015 nuclear agreement. And it was far from a perfect agreement. I'm not sure that he understood the details of the agreement enough. In fact, I know he didn't during the interviews we had, that he could articulate what he thought was wrong with it. But the fundamental thing that he thought was wrong with it was that Barack Obama had negotiated it. And you've seen a series of agreements that he's wanted to go remake. NAFTA turned into the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. It's not a whole lot different than NAFTA, but it's a Trump agreement. You've seen that happen with a number of other treaties. In the case of the nuclear agreement with Iran, he pulled out of it without a plan for how you would go replace it. And so the result is that the Iranians stayed inside it for about a year until the political pressures at home that came from the rise of sanctions made it impossible for them to stay in compliance. Now, the president is right. A flaw of the agreement is that it would have expired, key elements of it, not all of it, key elements of it would have expired by 2030. But what's happening now is that everything we feared would happen in 2030 is happening in 2020. And so while it was very good, thank goodness, we did not end up in a bigger conflict after the targeted killing of Soleimani 3 weeks ago. We are, at this point, I think, on a collision course if something doesn't break. And that something that doesn't break might be that the Iranians decide they're going to negotiate their way out of this. I doubt it, given the current forces. In North Korea, you've got the reverse, where the president did his fire and fury stuff, then decided that Kim Jong-un was his best buddy. We had a summit meeting in Singapore. I was there for it. We had another one that was far less successful in Vietnam. I was there for that one. And what's happened in the 18 months since? The North Koreans have just kept doing what they have always done. They have increased their stockpile of nuclear material. They have improved their missiles. The only thing they haven't done is test the ICBMs back and forth. And every time we write that the arsenal is increasing, the president gets out and he tweets, New York Times made it up again, fake news, so forth and so on. And our response is, not our assessment. It's the Defense Intelligence Agency's assessment. It's the CIA's assessment. And that's why he gets so angry at his intelligence agencies.
Right. So I hope we've left you with a few things to think about. And would you join me in thanking our panelists?